Have you ever wanted to make a copy of one of your favorite shirts, dresses, or pants without ripping it apart? Well, you're going to love this. Or do you have a favorite garment that's just falling apart because you wear it all the time? Well, let's bring it back to life. Today, I'm going to show you how to clone your clothes into a sewing pattern so you can make them over and over. And the best part is no pattern making experience is required. And trust me, it's easier than you think. Now let's dive in. So cloning a garment is taking something that you love. For me, it's this knit top that I just love, and I've worn it so many times. I have holes and bleach stains in the arms, and it's a little bit stretched out. I just love this. So I'm going to clone this today. And what we do is, so we take our favorite garment and we trace it onto a piece of paper or some fabric. We carefully trace the outline so we can get the general pattern. It's not about perfection. It's about copying something that fits us great. And we take all of that and then we recreate it. It is important that you use similar fabric when you're sewing, because I wouldn't want to take this lightweight knit and, create this in a linen or a cotton or even a heavier weight knit. It might not turn out the same way. So it's going to be important to try to find a fabric that's very similar to what you already have. And you can do this with many types of garments, tops, dresses, pants. I would stick with something unlined. I think that would be challenging to try to do this to something lined. And I would guess I would start with something, a simple garment to start, nothing with too many things. Like you can do this and you can transfer darts. But this has no darts in it, given it's a knit. So I'm going to start with something very simple, and I would recommend you do the same. You won't need a lot of tools to do this cloning. I would recommend you have some kind of measure. I like a measuring tape, is a little bit more versatile, or if you have any kind of ruler, that'll work as well. You'll need a pencil that you can trace around. I would recommend a pencil over a pen just because then you can erase if necessary. You need something to indicate areas that are not along the perimeter. So either a tracing wheel like I have here, or you can just use pins and you can just poke them through to make, we'll show you how that works. And some optional things would be a French curve. Absolutely don't need this, but it's useful if you have it. Some pattern weights just to hold down your garment. Again, not necessary. And then just some kind of large surface. I have my table, but you can use the floor as well, and some kind of paper. So I like this big roll of paper. I've had it for years, and I do a fair amount of pattern making, and it's still quite a lot left over. But you can use any paper that you have, wrapping paper, or you can just tape some, printer paper together if you have to. Whatever big piece of paper that you have, you can use. And if you want to know my favorite supplies, both essential and nice to have, grab my free supplies list for sewing and pattern making. If you want a printable checklist to build your sewing toolkit, the link's in the description below. So here we have the garment that I want to trace. It's this black knit top that I love. I've had for years. So I laid it out very carefully on my paper here, and I wanted to make sure that my seam here was right on the edge. It appears for my top the back is slightly wider than the front, so you'll see some wrinkles under here because the back isn't laying flat like the front is. All right, now we're going to be tracing the front, so all I care is that the front is laying flat. You will see I have pins down here. I folded it in half so I could identify where the center front is, because often when you have a pattern, you're just doing half of it. So this will be cut on the fold here. So I just want to go through here. I'm going to trace around the front of the neckline here, and the neckline is going to be deeper in the front than it is in the back here. You'll see my shoulder here is coming slightly forward, and that is very typical with patterns. Your shoulder seam is always sitting slightly forward, so you can just slightly see it. So this is perfect the way they did it. So I'll show you how we're going to make sure we're not going over here. We're going to go over where the seam line is, and I want to make sure the armhole is very flat. The shoulder seam in the front is often steeper than that is in the back, and the armhole in the front is typically much more curved and it's flatter in the back. So we want to trace whatever we see and not what we think. It's not going to be, the same in the front and the back. So we're going to do them both separately. So we'll get started, and we'll just take our pencil here and go around the easy perimeter. So I'm going to go right here, do a line. You'll see there's some slight shaping there in this garment, which I really like. It goes slightly in here at the waist. I love that. And then we'll go just straight across to there. And that's the only two outside edges I have right now. So now I'm going to pick up my tracing tool. It really helps to have a really sharp one. If you do not have a tracing tool, you can also use pins for this. These are my cheap pins, which I don't typically like because they're thick, and I usually have my nice pearl-headed pins, which are a lot more delicate, but I'm actually going to pull out these cheap pins for this application because they're heavier. So if you don't have a tracing wheel, you can just use pins, and what you would do is just poke them in here to make our marks. But we're going to use the tracing wheel because it is a lot faster. So I'll take the tracing wheel and I'll just go up this center front line as close to the pin there as I can go. Okay, so we go up to there, and then I'm going to want to go around the neck. We're going to go to the outside here. I'm going to keep my neck very simple, but we can always consider what to do here. They had put a little bit of a bias binding there. I'll have to reconsider what I want to do with that when I make it. And then we're going to go right over the seam of the shoulder, not where the fabric is out here, because that's where the front is slightly forward. So if I pull this over, you can see the line, and always do that before you lift up. See, it was a little weak right here because there was a lot of different pieces there. So always make sure that you can see the line properly. Then we're going to do, this is very important to properly do the armhole. You want this to be a little bit deeper there. I'm going to go right along the seam line. Let's hold it up, make sure that we can see it. So you can see it's really, really nice. It works quite nicely. And then you can take your French curve if you'd like and smooth this out just to make sure it's nice and smooth. So then we'll take these off, and just before we go too far, we just make sure I can see this line here that I did. So we can take the whole thing off, and there we go. We have all of our center seam, which we would want to straighten out. Because this we know is going to be a nice straight line. So it really is. Let's straighten that out more because it gets wobbly when every time you're doing this. You have to straighten things up after you to make sure that everything's in good shape. So I'm straightening that up so I don't need this line. It's more important that we're have a straight line then, this little bit that, the way I had it, pinned obviously was slightly askew. And we know that the shoulder seam is going to be a straight line, so I can make a straight line there. And if you, down here, we know this is a straight line at the base. So I'm just going to straighten that up. There we go, a nice straight line. And then you can take your French curve here if you want, if you have one, and just make this line a little bit smoother. There we go. So it's a little smoother, and the same thing here as we're drawing this, you'd want to make sure that this was nice, a nice curve. There we go. So we have a nice curve there. Oh, and we have to do this. Make sure this is always a right angle here. So you don't want it to go up or down, because then you'll get a peak or a trough there. So that would always be a nice right angle. And then just make a really nice curve here. There we go. So here is the center front. We're going to label everything. You're going to put a notch here in the center front. You're going to have usually about 3 inches up. You'll put a single notch here in the front for the armhole. We'll put that. Then we have to do seam allowances the whole way around. This is going to be on the fold. So when we lay our fabric out, this would be a fold. Typically a hem. Let's see how much hem we had on this one. Look at your garment. You can see how much hem. So they had a 1/2 inch hemmed up. So we'll add a full inch so we can fold it over here at the bottom. This just comes straight down because this is the center front. And then you have to decide your perimeter here, how much seam allowance you want. So typically, well, for knits, you could put a very small seam allowance if you plan to just use the serger. Maybe you just want to put a 1/4 inch. I typically just do a 1/2 inch the whole way around. It's just easy with this ruler to see that where that 1/2 inch is. But you could do 3/8 of an inch. If you prefer 5/8, I think for a knit, 5/8 is a little much, but whatever you're comfortable with, it doesn't really matter. Just put the seam allowance the entire way around. And then usually even though I'll do a 1/2 inch there, in these curved areas, I'll do a 1/4 inch. Make sure you have a right angle there too. Then let's see what kind of, we have to think through what you want to do with the neck. This has a little bit of a bias binding there. So I think we could assume that if we did a 1/4 inch to sew the bias binding on there, we went out to the bias binding, which is 1/4 inch. So we'll just assume we have 1/4 inch here as our seam allowance that we can sew on the bias binding. And the bias binding is, yeah, the 1/4 inch. So we could just sew on, we would have to make a inch bias binding because it would be folded over in half. So 1/4 plus 1/4 is 1/2. And then our seam allowance for the bias binding is also 1/4 inch. So the bias binding would be 1 inch. So we would just come to here. That's how I would do that, to do a bias binding there. And we're going to have sleeves here. So I'll show you how to do sleeves. So we need to put the grain line on here. So typically the grain line is going to be to be parallel to the center front. So there's our grain line. We're going to label this. This would be a front top knit. I'll put, and if you want to call it something, you might want to call it my favorite top, or whatever like name you want to give it, just so you can identify it in the future. I'm going to write cut 1 on fold, and we're going to put the date. You're going to write your date on there. I always like to know when I did it, or if I'm making any modifications, I put the date of the modification. Down here is the hem. And there we go. There we have the front. And now let's do the back, and then we have to do the sleeves. Now we have the back laid out. Again, I've identified the center, so you can see it's a little wonky. So we're going to straighten this out though eventually, but this just gives us a general idea where the center front is. You can take more care if you want to really make sure that's aligned, but we can do that at the end. It's just a little bit more challenging laying this one out because the back is slightly wider than the front. So I had to make sure, you'll see some wrinkles under here in the front. I had to make sure I really pulled it over so I properly had the seam here on the edge. And the same here, if you remembered, I had to pull this up and around because it did tend to curl towards the front. So I need to make sure I have the proper line there. And then here our armhole will be a little less deep here. It's a little flatter in the back. This is probably going to be a little less steep here too. And then our back neckline is much, much higher here. And we'll do the same application with the bias binding there. So let's get started. We'll do this again. So I'm going to go straight along here. It gives a little bit of an indent there at the waist, which I love. We're going to go across here. Then we're going to do this straight line up here, relatively straight line up here. We're going to go here. We can go I was able to pull this up, so I have that here, and I can do this, the neckline also. Cut down around the neckline also. Then I just need to carefully identify. I'm pressing rather hard here just to make sure I'm going through the paper. Okay, then lift it up just to make sure. Yep, I got that. So that looks good. Let's take the weights away. We have everything identified. So let me straighten this up here. Probably helps if you have a longer ruler. Want that to be completely straight, so just make sure, probably a longer ruler will help you make sure that's completely straight there. I'm going to straighten out my hemline, of course. It gets really wonky when I'm trying to do it by hand. And straighten out my side. Sometimes even your side will be slightly different in both the front and the back. So don't assume they're going to be the same necessarily. Whatever it is, you just go with what's the pattern has. Now, of course, I've had this garment for a really long time, so it could be stretched out in certain places. Very possible, but I'm going to go make sure I have a right angle there. But we can always make some adjustments here when we try our muslin. So after we get the pattern cut out, we're going to cut this up in similar fabric as what we're going to eventually make it in, but something that's not very expensive, so we can make sure. We might have to make some adjustments if we do something and it doesn't seem quite right. Okay, so we add our seam allowances. Remember, we added an inch at the bottom for the hem, so we'll do the same thing here. Inch at the bottom, and the center, this is the center back, so this goes straight down. We'll identify as the center back, and we can also do this on the fold. We can just, while we're here, we'll put our grain line in. We did a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the sides. And you take more care than I am. I'm moving very quickly. I did 1/2 inch here at the shoulder. And then I did a 1/4 inch around the curved armhole. We want this at a right angle here. Okay. And then if you recall, we decided that this was the outer edge. And so since we needed to, that was actually including the bias binding. So we just decided that would, we would put the seam on the inside here, and that allows the 1/4 inch bias binding on the outside. So we want a 1 inch bias binding there. And we do 2 notches here in the back. Let's go up like maybe 3 1/4, 2 notches. Make sure when we do our sleeve, the notches will be in the same location. It's, generally they're like 3 1/4 inch, but it really is more important that they just match what your sleeve is. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but it is right around here is where you want it, because if you're doing any sort of like easing or gathering, it all goes above here. So it is sort of, you do want this right around here, because anything underneath these notches, you never gather or ease underneath there. You want that to be nice and smooth. Again, we'll label this as back, top, knit, cut 1 on fold, and then put the date. And we're going to put a notch at the center front there, center back, notch at the center back as well. And yep, so there we go. There's our back one. Now we need to do our sleeves. The sleeve is laid out. I tried to be as flat as possible. The seam, the underarm seam is right there. I put that right so it was on the edge. Tried to make it lay out as flat as I can. And particularly here, as we know, we need to make sure this front curve, which is typically a bigger, depth than the back, is a little flatter. So we definitely want to adjust. This is the front. You can see here's the front neckline. So I'm going to trace. Now this is a really nice straight line. So, well, it's straightish. Let's call it. Maybe it is straight down here. So I'm going to use my straight edge to help me a little bit on these areas that are a little bit straighter. So draw there, draw right across here. And then we're just going to draw this, this line. This is going to be our center line here, front and back, but we can still draw it. It's a little askew here, but I'm going to just, I'll let that go. I'll just do that in a moment. So let's go. Okay, so that's our center line. And then we're going to take our tracing wheel to carefully do this part at the armhole. Okay, let's carefully lift it. Just let me peek underneath there, make sure I got it all. I think that looks good. Then we're going to just carefully rotate this over and line it back up. I don't want to stretch it. Let's get it lined back up there. Pull that out, get the wrinkles out. This is the back now. Okay. Take your time with this because we want to make sure we have a good sleeve. So we'll do a straight line here where we can. Across here. Let's do a complete straight line across there. There's a little bit of a curve here. Okay. And use our tracing wheel to do the back, which is knits. There's not as much differentiation between the armholes and the shoulder slant for knits as you would get in wovens, because you need that room for movement. Knits just move with you, so it's not as, so we might not see as big of a difference. So you can see this dips in a little bit more here. This is a little bit flatter. So that's what I was saying before. That's typically what you see in an armhole. So it's quite important that you do both front and back and not just do a half and just assume they're both the same. So this dips in a little bit more there. This is our center line. Now this is our sleeve. This is the back and this is the front. Let's just finish that line off. Now you can do your grain line a variety of places. Maybe you want it here, or sometimes I just put it here at the underarm. So you decide where you want your grain line, but put your grain line in. And we're going to cut one. Well, actually cut two. We need one for each arm. Cut two, we'll put the date, but it's not on the fold. It's just two full ones because we have the back and the front. This is one full sleeve. This is your underarm seam that goes to here. So you want to measure here and measure here. These two should be the same measurement because they need to sew together. This is our shoulder seam here. So you want to, when we're folding it, we want to make sure that our shoulder seam is where we fold it. So there we would notch it to know that we're going to line this up with that shoulder seam on the bodice portion. And if you recall, we went up to do our notch. We did 3 1/4 here. Put our notch here, and over here we did 3. So just, I'm just going to put these in, but you want to go and, measure your actual other pattern and make sure these two align. It's quite important that this is in the same place as the bodice notches are, and the same as here. So 1 notch always indicates the front and 2 notch always indicates the back. Then we need to add our seam allowance. Decide, I think I'll put 1/2 inch seam allowance on the arm here. So, I went a little skew there. Goes there. And then we have to look at our sleeves to see what kind of seam allowance they gave us here. It's also 1/2 inch, so we'll add 1 inch to the bottom as well, just like we did at the base, because it was folded up, so it turns into a 1/2 inch. Pull that down. That's the hem. And recall, on the sleeve, we did a 1/4 inch at the sleeve on the bodice. So you have to do the same seam allowance here. It's quite important that you do the same seam allowance when you're sewing 2 seams together. So we're going to put a 1/4 inch here around. And this would be, again, a right angle right there. Okay, there's our seam allowances the entire way around, and we've labeled everything. We've put our notches in. So we have our sleeve. So we would then cut these pattern pieces out, and then we would put it on our fabric and, like I said, do a muslin first. You want to make sure you use some inexpensive fabric to try it out, and then try it on, see how it fits, and make any modifications right onto this. If you find it's too long or too short or whatever, your issues are, make sure you then take those and bring them back onto your pattern. So then every time we make it, it'll, fit us great. Now that we have our pattern, it's really important to test it out. So find a similar weight and stretch fabric to test it out, but that is not too expensive. And give it a test, and you might need to make some adjustments because, again, this is not perfect like when you're drafting your own pattern, but it's really, really great way to get your favorite, shape down. So perhaps, you're going to make some minor tweaks with this muslin or test, garment. And once you make that, make sure you bring them back into your paper pattern, whatever changes you made. So then you can make this over and over many times. And then after you have finalized your pattern with, making any minor adjustments you needed to after your muslin, I put a hole through the top and hang it on a pattern hook, and I put mine in my closet. You may want to put it in an envelope, whatever method you choose, but you want to store it away and not just throw it in a corner someplace, because hopefully you'll make this over and over. I number each one of my pattern pieces. So if I'm at pattern 50, the next one will be 51, and I can tell I can easily then find my next pattern because I do a sketch of all of my designs, and at the top I put a number here. And so if I want to make this dress again, everything is in chronological order in my closet, and I can easily go find what I made. And here I put down what fabric I used for that dress, which is really helpful. And then up here, I have the swatch book. So all my swatches are here. So I can go and, feel the fabric, see where I purchased it from, what the fiber content is. I have all of this swatch book template in the link below. So check it out if you want to get your copy of yours as well. If cloning your own clothes have gotten you excited about continuing to make more patterns, check out this video here where I talk about how to get your hands on a sloper so you can make any design you want, not just cloning a design you already have in your closet. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.